The ticket was stamped one way. When Josh asked the conductor what that meant, the man looked up with a hollow stare and whispered, "You'll find out at the end of the line." It was supposed to be a routine overnight journey. Josh had caught the last train out of the city, hoping to reach his destination by morning. He was tired, ready to sleep through the ride, but the ticket he'd been given looked strange. It was old, weathered, and instead of a return date, it simply read, "One way." He didn't think much of it at first. Trains sometimes had quirks, after all. He settled into the near-empty carriage, the clacking of the wheels on the rails lulling him into a sense of calm. As the hours passed, Josh noticed something odd. No announcements had been made about the stops, and when he looked out the window, the landscape seemed wrong. It was too dark, too misty, as though they were passing through some forgotten land. He checked his phone. No service. A creeping sense of unease started to settle in. He decided to get up and ask the conductor about their route. As he made his way through the carriages, Josh noticed something unsettling. The passengers. They were silent, completely still. Some sat with their heads bowed, others staring blankly ahead. No one was talking, no one was moving. It was as if they weren't really there. Finally, he reached the conductor at the front of the train. The man was tall, dressed in an outdated uniform with a cap that cast a shadow over his face. "Excuse me," Josh said. "Where exactly are we heading? This isn't the usual route." The conductor slowly lifted his head. His eyes were dark, almost lifeless. "This train," he said in a low voice, "isn't bound for the living." Josh blinked, thinking he'd misheard. "What?" The conductor's lips curled into a grim smile. "You boarded the last carriage of the night. This train doesn't stop until it reaches the final destination." Josh's pulse quickened. "Final destination? What do you mean?" The conductor handed him back his ticket, pointing to the words etched into the old paper. "One way. You're already halfway there." Josh backed away, trying to grasp what was happening. "There's got to be a mistake," he stammered. "I didn't sign up for this." But the conductor's expression didn't change. "You didn't. They did." Before Josh could ask who they were, the lights in the train flickered and the carriage lurched. The doors to the next car slammed shut behind him, and a low, ghostly whistle echoed through the air. Panicking, Josh turned to run back to his seat, but when he passed through the cars, they were different. The passengers were now watching him. Their eyes, hollow and empty, tracked his every move. Their faces were pale, drained of color, and their bodies seemed to shift unnaturally, as though they weren't entirely solid. Josh's heart pounded in his chest. He needed to get off this train, but there were no stops in sight, just endless fog rolling past the windows. Suddenly, the train slowed, creaking as it pulled into a decrepit station. The platform was old, overgrown with weeds, and the signs were faded and unreadable. The train's doors opened with a screech. Josh's instincts screamed at him to stay on board, but as he glanced around, the ghostly passengers began to rise from their seats, advancing slowly toward him. Their faces twisted into eerie grins, eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. With no other choice, Josh bolted out of the train, landing on the crumbling platform. The moment his feet hit the ground, the train's doors slammed shut, and the whistle screamed one last time as it disappeared into the mist, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Alone. He looked around, hoping to find some clue as to where he was. But the station was deserted, abandoned long ago, and as the mist began to close in around him, he realized the horrible truth. The final destination wasn't a place. It was the end of the line for everyone who stepped aboard that train. The wind howled through the dark, desolate train station, carrying with it the distant whistle of an approaching train. Sam, a veteran conductor, had worked the Hollow Bridge line for over 20 years, and though he didn't consider himself superstitious, there was one story that never left his mind. Every conductor had heard of the ghost train, but most dismissed it as a tall tale passed down through generations. But tonight, something felt different. It was a cold, foggy night, and the midnight train was unusually empty. Sam glanced at the time, 11:50 p.m. 10 minutes before the last stop, he leaned back in his seat, listening to the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels on the track, when suddenly a chill ran down his spine. A low, mournful whistle echoed through the mist-covered valley. But it wasn't the familiar whistle of his train. It was distant, almost like a cry, as if the air itself were mourning. Sam sat up straight. Another train? On this track? There shouldn't be any. Grabbing his flashlight, Sam stepped into the aisle to check on the passengers. As he walked through the carriages, he noticed something strange. Every seat was empty. He remembered there had been at least 3 passengers when they left the last station. He had seen them with his own eyes. Now, they were gone. The train slowed as it approached the infamous Hollow Bridge, a narrow, creaky span that stretched over a deep ravine. Sam's heart raced as he peered out the window into the fog. He had heard the old ghost stories about Hollow Bridge, but he had never believed them. Supposedly, many years ago, a train had derailed there, sending dozens of passengers plunging into the abyss below. Ever since, it was said, the ghosts of that fateful train roamed the tracks, eternally searching for the station they would never reach. The train rolled onto the bridge, and a dense fog swallowed everything outside the window. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the unsettling creak of the old bridge. But as Sam reached the last car, he saw something that made him freeze. A single figure sat in the corner seat, dressed in a tattered black coat and an old-fashioned hat. His head was down, his hands resting on a cane. Sam felt his throat tighten. The man hadn't been there before. Taking a deep breath, Sam approached. "Sir, we're approaching the final stop. Can I see your ticket?" The man didn't move. Sam tried again. "Sir?" Slowly, the man lifted his head, revealing a gaunt, pale face and hollow eyes that seemed to stare through Sam rather than at him. His lips parted, and in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, he whispered, "We're not stopping. Not tonight." Sam stepped back, heart pounding. His flashlight flickered, vanished, for a split second, disappearing into thin air. He saw something impossible. Sam rushed back to the control cabin, translucent, hands trembling, form flickering like static. He grabbed the radio and called the engineer. But before Sam could react, the man simply panic began to claw at him as the train continued to speed over the bridge. He checked his instruments, but the controls were unresponsive. The train wasn't slowing down. In fact, it seemed to be accelerating, as if being pulled by some unseen force. He glanced out the window again, and what he saw chilled him to the core. Another train was speeding alongside them, barely visible through the thick fog. Its carriages were old, rusted, and decayed, with windows shattered and doors hanging open. Inside, shadowy figures sat eerily still, their faces turned toward Sam's train. He could see them, could feel their hollow eyes watching him. His breath quickened. This couldn't be happening. That train, the one beside them, looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But it was keeping perfect pace with them, riding the same tracks. Suddenly, the old train let out a deafening, ghostly whistle, a sound so haunting it felt like it pierced through Sam's very soul. The fog grew thicker, swirling like a living thing, and the bridge creaked beneath them as if it were about to collapse. The train jolted, and Sam was thrown to the floor. When he scrambled back to his feet and looked out the window, the other train was gone, vanished into the mist as if it had never been there. But the nightmare wasn't over. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the empty carriages. Whispers filled the air, soft, unintelligible voices, as though dozens of unseen passengers were murmuring just out of reach. Desperate, Sam rushed back through the cars, hoping to find someone, anyone. But every seat was empty, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He stopped in his tracks when he saw something horrifying. In the middle of the aisle, a newspaper lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The headline read, "Train Tragedy. Dozens Killed in Hollow Bridge Disaster." The date was from 50 years ago. Sam's mind raced. This was the train, the one that had crashed, the one that never made it to its destination. And now he was part of it. Suddenly, the train screeched as it hurtled off the bridge, just as the old stories had said. Sam braced for impact, but instead of falling into the ravine below, the train plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. It was as if the world had dissolved around him, leaving only the train and the deafening roar of the wind. Then silence. When Sam opened his eyes, the train was still. He was no longer on the bridge. In fact, he wasn't anywhere familiar. The train had pulled into a station, An old, crumbling station bathed in an unnatural, dim light. The sign overhead was rusted, barely legible. Last stop, nowhere. As the doors creaked open, Sam heard footsteps behind him. He turned, heart pounding, and saw the man from earlier, standing at the entrance. He smiled, a cold, lifeless smile. "This is where you get off." Sam stepped back, but there was no escape. He knew then, with a sinking dread, that he had boarded the last train. The train that never truly stopped. The train of the dead. And so, Sam disappeared, becoming just another whisper in the legend of the Hollow Bridge ghost train. Some say, if you listen closely on a foggy night, you can still hear the distant wail of the midnight train. And if you're unlucky enough to see it, well, you might just find yourself aboard, riding endlessly, never reaching your destination.